12,800 years ago, something stopped the world. Not slowly, not gradually, the way we imagine the ancient past, moving in long, quiet arcs across thousands of years. It stopped the way a fire stops when you pour water over it. Sudden, complete, almost as if someone gave the order. The glaciers that had been retreating for 1,000 years reversed direction overnight. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped by as much as 15 degrees in what scientists believe was less than a decade. In some ice cores, the shift appears to have happened in a single season. One summer, one autumn, and then a winter that lasted for over 1,200 years. Think about that for a moment. 1,200 years of winter. That is 60 generations of human beings born into a cold world, living in it, dying in it, in never knowing anything different. 60 generations who never saw the world their great-great-grandparents knew. The warm world. The green world. The world that had been slowly, beautifully healing after a long ice age. And then it was gone. Scientists call this event the Younger Dryas, named after a small white flower that only blooms in Arctic cold. When that flower's pollen suddenly reappears in ancient sediment layers that have been filled with the pollen of forests and warm grasslands, it means one thing: the cold came back. But the cold was not the strangest part. The strangest part is what disappeared along with the warmth. Welcome. And thank you for being here tonight. Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle into whatever surface is beneath you. The night is quiet where you are. The world outside is still. And what you are about to hear is a story written in ice and stone and the bones of creatures that no longer walk this earth. Before you drift towards sleep, let this question sit gently in your mind. What if the civilization we think of as the beginning of human history was not the beginning at all? What if there was something before it, something advanced enough to leave marks in stone that have outlasted 40 centuries of rain and wind and war, something that understood the sky not as a mystery, but as a map, not as a symbol, but as a calendar, a clock, a language older than any alphabet we have ever found? And what if whatever happened 12,800 years ago was not just a climate event? What if it was an ending? Let us go back. Not to the cold. Not yet. Let us go back to the world as it was before. Imagine standing on open grassland somewhere in what is now the Middle East, the land between rivers, the place that much later would be called Mesopotamia. The year is 14,000 years ago. The ice age is loosening its grip. The sky at night is impossibly clear. Every star is sharp and brilliant in a way that no human being alive today has ever seen, because there are no cities within 1,000 miles. No light, no noise, just the stars and the silence and the grass moving softly in a warm wind. The mammoths are still here. They graze in herds that stretch to the horizon. Great woolly elephants of the north, their tusks sweeping like ivory crescents through the long grass. Giant ground sloths move through the forest edges, slow and enormous. Horses and camels native to this land drift across the plains. Saber-toothed cats watch from the shadows, patient and unhurried. It is a world full of life, a world that has survived the worst of the ice age and is now opening up, warming slowly, offering new territories, new food, new possibility to every creature willing to move. And the humans are moving. In the Levant, in the hills and valleys of what is now Israel and Jordan and Syria, small communities are experimenting with something new. They are not quite farmers yet, but they are no longer purely nomadic either. They are settling near reliable water sources. They are building stone foundations for their homes. They are storing wild grain in cool pits dug into the earth. They are grinding seeds, weaving baskets, burying their dead in the floors of their houses. Archaeologists call these people the Natufians. And if you walked into one of their villages on a warm evening 14,000 years ago, you would recognize what you saw. Families around a fire, children sleeping, someone keeping watch, the smell of grain and smoke. These were people building towards something. You could feel it in their tools, which were growing more precise, in their trade networks, which were growing longer, in their art, which was growing more complex, in their curiosity about the sky above them, which never seemed to diminish. The stars were important to them. The patterns of light overhead told them when to plant, when to move, when the rains would come. The sky was a calendar, and they were learning to read it. Farther east, in the valleys of what would become the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, similar communities were taking root. Farther north, on a limestone plateau in what is now southeastern Turkey, something else was beginning. Something that would not be discovered by modern archaeologists until 1994. Something enormous, carved into stone, buried deliberately, waiting. But we will come to that. First, the cold. If you look deeper into the ice cores drilled from the center of Greenland, you will find a layer that scientists study more carefully than almost any other. It is thin, just a few centimeters in places. But within that thin layer, everything changes. The chemistry of the air trapped inside shifts suddenly. Temperatures recorded in the oxygen isotopes drop sharply, dramatically. The pollen from warm climate trees and grasses vanishes. The pollen of cold tundra plants appears. The dust levels spike, always suggesting fierce, dry winds across a suddenly barren landscape. 1 year, the world was warming. The ice was retreating. The forests were spreading northward. The great experiment of early human settlement was underway. The next year, winter arrived, and it did not leave for 1,200 years. The scientific name for what triggered this is still debated, but the leading idea is this. As the glaciers melted across North America, the meltwater had to go somewhere. It pooled into an enormous inland sea called Lake Agassiz, a body of water so large it dwarfed anything we have today. Larger than all 5 of the modern Great Lakes combined. An inland ocean of cold, fresh water held in place by an ice dam. And then, at some point, the dam broke. Tens of thousands of cubic kilometers of fresh water poured into the North Atlantic. And fresh water, unlike salt water, does not sink. It floats. It sits on the surface. And when it sits on the surface of the North Atlantic, it blocks the ocean current that carries heat from the tropics northward. The Atlantic overturning circulation, the great conveyor belt of warmth that keeps northern Europe and the North Atlantic region far warmer than they would otherwise be, stuttered, slowed. In some models, it effectively stopped. And without that heat, the North froze. This is the mainstream scientific explanation for the Younger Dryas. A flood, an ocean current, a cold snap that lasted a millennium. But here is what mainstream science does not fully explain. Why did so many other things end at exactly the same moment? Let the silence hold that question for a moment. The mammoths. Within the window of the Younger Dryas, 35 separate genera of large mammals went extinct across North America. Not just species, entire categories of animal. Mammoths and mastodons, gone. American lions, gone. Short-faced bears, gone. The giant ground sloth, some of which stood 12 feet tall, gone. Native horses and camels, both of which had evolved on the North American continent over millions of years, gone. On other continents, similar patterns. Woolly rhinoceroses, gone. Cave lions, gone. Straight-tusked elephants, gone. Scientists argue about the cause. Some say it was climate. The sudden cold disrupted habitats that had supported these animals for hundreds of thousands of years. Some say it was human hunters spreading across new continents with advanced weapons, hunting prey that had never evolved to fear this particular kind of predator. But here is what neither theory fully explains. These animals had survived multiple ice ages before. They had survived shifts in climate far larger and longer than the younger Dryas. They had coexisted with human hunters in other parts of the world without disappearing. Something about this particular moment was different. And then there is the black mat. The black mat is what archaeologists call a thin, dark layer of sediment that appears across hundreds of sites in North America, all dated to the same moment, the boundary of the younger Dryas. It contains charcoal, suggesting enormous fires. It contains unusual concentrations of iridium and platinum, elements that are rare in the Earth's crust but common in meteorites and asteroids. It contains microscopic glass spheres that form only under extreme heat and pressure. And it contains nanodiamonds, crystals that exist only when something creates temperatures and pressures far beyond anything achieved in a wildfire or a volcanic eruption. In 2007, a group of researchers published a theory. They proposed that 12,800 years ago, just as humanity was beginning to stir towards something new, the Earth was struck not by a single large object, but by a fragmented comet or swarm of space debris. The impacts happened mostly over the Laurentide ice sheet in North America. The explosions were not from craters, but from airbursts, cosmic impacts that detonated in the atmosphere above the ice, releasing energies comparable to many nuclear weapons simultaneously. The fires would have been unlike anything the Earth had seen in recorded history. Continent-scale infernos. The smoke would have reached the stratosphere and spread across the northern hemisphere, blocking sunlight for years. Temperatures would have dropped sharply. The vast melting ice sheet, struck by enormous energy, would have released its meltwater all at once into the Atlantic. The conveyor belt would have collapsed. The winter would have begun. This is called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and it remains one of the most controversial ideas in modern paleoclimatology. Some researchers have found supporting evidence: the exotic materials in the black mat, elevated platinum in sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East, all at the same layer. Others have challenged the data, questioned the methodology, proposed alternative explanations. In 2018, scientists discovered a circular depression buried under the Greenland ice sheet, roughly 31 kilometers across, large enough to be a significant impact crater. They named it Hiawatha. For a brief moment, it seemed like the smoking gun had been found. But dating a structure buried under kilometers of ice is not simple. Subsequent work suggests Hiawatha may be far older than 12,800 years, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years old, perhaps millions. The debate continues. And somewhere beneath all of this, beneath the science and the sediment and the ice cores, a quieter question waits. What were the people experiencing it? What did it look like from the ground? Tonight, wherever you are listening from, I want you to imagine a sky full of light. Not stars, brighter than stars. Or you are standing on open ground. It is dark. The fire in your settlement is behind you. You stepped outside to breathe the cold air, because the night is clear and the stars above the valley are extraordinary, the way they always are, on a clear night, far from any other light. And then the horizon begins to glow. At first it looks like sunrise, but it is coming from the wrong direction, and it is growing too fast. The glow expands and brightens and breaks apart into separate streaks across the sky, dozens of them, moving too quickly for clouds, too bright for lightning. The air changes. Something in the sound changes. A pressure in your ears, a vibration in your chest. You do not have words for what you are seeing. Your language has words for fire and sky and fear and wonder, but nothing that quite captures this. And then, far away on the horizon, the light becomes solid. A column of something rises up, taller than any mountain, taller than anything you have ever imagined, spreading sideways at its top like a tree made of fire. And the sound reaches you. Not a sound exactly, a wave. A physical force that passes through you and through the ground beneath your feet at the same time. Then more columns, then more. The sky fills with something falling, and the night that was clear and cold and full of stars becomes something else entirely. You run, but where do you run when the sky is falling and the horizon is on fire in 4 directions? The Clovis people of North America were perhaps the most successful hunter-gatherers the continent had ever seen. Named for a site in New Mexico where their distinctive stone spear points were first found. They had spread across the entire continent within roughly 500 years. A culture so effective, so mobile, so precisely attuned to the megafauna herds they hunted that archaeologists still marvel at the engineering of their tools. The Clovis spear point is a beautiful object, fluted, aerodynamic, designed with a channel running up the center that made it easier to attach to a wooden shaft and more stable in flight. These were not crude survival tools. They were precision instruments, the product of generations of refinement and accumulated knowledge. At the Younger Dryas boundary, the Clovis culture disappears from the archaeological record. Not slowly, not gradually. The classic fluted points stop appearing. The long-distance trade networks collapse. The pattern of large kill sites vanishes. In its place, scattered regional traditions emerge. Folsom here, Dalton there. Different shapes, different strategies, different scales. Smaller prey, more varied diets, less unity. It is not that the people disappeared. They survived, but their world did not. If you have spent your entire life, and your parents' entire lives, and their parents' entire lives, learning to hunt mammoths on open grassland, and the mammoths are gone, and the grassland is gone, and the winter will not end, then you do not simply adjust. You rebuild from almost nothing. The culture that emerges on the other side of the Younger Dryas looks different, sounds different, thinks differently. The stories it tells its children are different, because the world those children will grow up in requires different stories. This is one of the places where science and mythology almost touch. Across human cultures on every continent, there are stories about a flood, a great flood that ended an earlier world, a catastrophic rising of waters, a sky on fire, a darkness, a cold, a world remade. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest written story ever discovered, preserved on clay tablets from ancient Sumer, a man named Utnapishtim is warned by a god of a coming flood. He builds a vessel. He survives. The world he returns to is not the world he left. In Hindu traditions, a great fish warns Manu of a coming deluge. He builds a boat and survives to plant the seeds of the next world. In the myths of many Native American nations, there are stories of a previous world destroyed by water and cold and fire, from which a few people escaped to begin again. In ancient Mesopotamia, in the texts that scholars have spent 2 centuries translating from cuneiform clay tablets, there are references to a period before the flood when something extraordinary existed. A time of kings who reigned for impossibly long periods. A time when the gods themselves walked among people. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki. The name translates, roughly, as those who came from the sky to earth. Or in some interpretations, those of royal blood who came down from the heavens. It depends on which scholar you ask, which tablets you read, which tradition you follow. But the Anunnaki appear in Sumerian text not as vague supernatural beings. They appear as administrators, engineers, decision makers. They argue with each other. They have hierarchies. They make mistakes and correct them. They hold councils to decide the fate of humanity. They have names, personalities, areas of expertise. Anu, who ruled the heavens. Enlil, who commanded the earth and the winds. Enki, lord of deep waters and wisdom, the one credited in multiple texts with creating or shaping humanity. Inanna, the great queen of the sky, associated with the morning and evening star. These were not abstract forces of nature. They were characterized as beings with intentions and agendas, beings who had been here for a very long time. Modern scholars interpret the Anunnaki as mythological representations of natural forces, the thunder and the flood, the fertile soil and the dry wind, personified and given names so that early humans could relate to and explain the world around them. But what if the direction of that interpretation runs the other way? What if the stories came before the symbolism? What if the Anunnaki were remembered imperfectly across thousands of years of oral tradition, not because they symbolized nature, but because they existed in it? This is the question that sits at the center of a different kind of reading of the ancient texts, not a mainstream scientific reading, not a literal theological reading either, something in between, a reading that takes seriously the possibility that the deepest human memories are not invented. They are compressed, they are translated through generations and cultures and languages until the original meaning becomes almost unrecognizable. But the shape remains. And the shape of these oldest stories is always the same. A time before, an advanced civilization, a catastrophe, a flood, a new beginning. Let your breathing slow now. Wherever you are tonight, let the darkness around you become something peaceful. Let it become the darkness of a clear night 12,000 years ago, somewhere on the edge of a river valley where the stars are close enough to touch. The fire is low. The settlement is quiet. Most people are sleeping, but someone is awake, as someone always is, keeping watch. They are not afraid of the dark. They have lived their whole lives in it. The dark is familiar and full of meaning. The stars above them are not decorations. They are a map, a calendar, a language. This person knows the sky, the way you might know the streets of a city where you grew up. And they are watching something they have never seen before. A single point of light moving slowly across the field of fixed stars, moving with purpose, moving in a direction no star moves. They do not know what to make of it, but they watch it night after night, and they remember, and someday they will try to describe what they saw to their children, and their children's children, and the story will travel across generations and cultures and languages until it arrives, changed almost beyond recognition, in a clay tablet somewhere in southern Mesopotamia, and a scribe will press his reed into wet clay and record the words that will wait underground for 5,000 years to be found. We are those finders, and we are only beginning to understand what was found. The site is called Göbekli Tepe. In Turkish, the name means Potbelly Hill. It sits on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, overlooking what was once a fertile valley and is now dry steppe. Wheat, both wild and domesticated, grows on the surrounding slopes. The Euphrates River is visible in the distance on a clear day. Archaeologists discovered it in 1994. Or rather, they rediscovered it. Kurdish farmers had been finding stones there for years, reporting them as old gravestones. The stones turned out to be something else entirely. Göbekli Tepe is a series of circular enclosures, each composed of massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in rings. The pillars are up to 6 meters tall and weigh as much as 20 tons. They are carved with extraordinary precision. Animals cover their surfaces in high relief. Foxes, scorpions, vultures, snakes, wild boar, cranes, ducks, spiders, and among the animals, abstract symbols whose meaning no one has fully decoded. The largest enclosure contains 2 central pillars, taller than the others, positioned like silent guardians at the center of the circle. Their T-shaped tops resemble stylized human shoulders. They have hands carved on their sides, reaching downward, fingers pressing against a low belt. They are not abstract. They represent beings. Beings large enough to need 20-ton stone pillars to contain their image. The site was built approximately 11,600 years ago. Think about that date. 11,600 years ago. The Younger Dryas had just ended. The 1,200-year winter was over. The mammoths were gone. The Clovis culture had collapsed. The Natufian villages of the Levant had weathered the cold and begun their slow turn toward agriculture. And someone, right at that exact moment, right at the transition out of the deepest climate shock humanity had experienced in recorded history, gathered enough people together to quarry, carve, transport, and erect dozens of stone pillars, each weighing as much as 20 tons in precise geometric arrangements, decorated with sophisticated imagery, with stone tools, without cities, without writing, without metal, without wheels. A civilization this determined does not build monuments to nothing. A society that can organize the labor required to lift 20 tons of stone does not do so randomly. The choices made at Göbekli Tepe, the specific animals chosen, the placement of the enclosures, the orientation of the central pillars, these are not accidents. Researchers have found that the central pillars in several enclosures appear to be aligned with specific star positions as they appeared in the sky around the time of construction. The pillar decorations seem to encode astronomical information, specific constellations, specific dates. Some researchers have proposed that Göbekli Tepe is not simply a temple, it is a record, an archive of information encoded in stone, placed underground deliberately at some point after its construction, preserved against the possibility that the knowledge it contained would otherwise be lost. Lost to what? Lost to another event, like the one that had just ended. If you look deeper into the stories of the ancient Sumerians, into the oldest layers of the cuneiform texts, you find something that modern translators often treat as purely mythological, but that contains a peculiar precision. The Sumerians described a time before the flood as a time of extraordinary knowledge. The antediluvian period, the scholars call it, the time before the waters rose. In those texts, human civilization was not primitive. It was advanced, guided by the Anunnaki, who brought the gifts of civilization to humanity. Agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine. These were not invented by struggling nomads over thousands of years of trial and error. According to the texts, they were given, delivered, installed. The Sumerian word is mi, usually translated as divine laws or cosmic principles. The mi were the fundamental rules and technologies of civilization, kept by the gods and distributed to humanity in specific ways at specific times. They included things like the descent into the underworld, the ascent from the underworld, the priestly arts, the arts of writing, the scribal art, the musical arts, the craft of the smith. They also included, intriguingly, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, and the flooding of the earth. In the text known as the Legend of Inanna and Enki, the goddess travels to the abyssal waterhouse of Enki to obtain the mi and bring them to her city. Enki possesses them all in his vast domain, and Inanna seeks to acquire them. The text reads like an inventory of civilization itself. Whether this is mythology or history encoded in mythological language is a question that scholars have debated for over a century. But here is what is undeniable. The Sumerians appeared, historically speaking, with extraordinary suddenness. Around 5,000 years ago, in the river valleys of what is now southern Iraq, a civilization emerged that possessed writing, advanced mathematics, complex astronomy, sophisticated irrigation systems, codified law, organized religion, and architecture on a scale that would not be seen in Europe for another 2,000 years. They did not slowly develop these things from more primitive beginnings, Or if they did, that development happened in a period we cannot see, before the written record begins. When we first encounter the Sumerians clearly in the archaeological record, they are already advanced. As if the knowledge had been given to them from somewhere else. As if they were remembering, rather than discovering. I want you to think about memory now, as you drift towards sleep. Not personal memory, collective memory. The kind of memory that lives not in individual minds, but in stories told by firelight, in carvings pressed into stone, in the careful astronomical alignments of monuments built to outlast every other human-made thing. We think of memory as fragile, and in some ways it is. Within a few generations, the names of ordinary people disappear. The details of daily life dissolve. Languages shift and break and become unrecognizable to the people who once spoke them. But certain kinds of memory are stubborn. The memory of catastrophe is stubborn. The memory of loss is stubborn. The memory of a world that was better, warmer, more abundant, and then disappeared, is stubborn in ways that pure invention is not. When you find the same story on every inhabited continent, told by people who had no contact with each other, encoded in the oldest religious texts of civilizations that arose independently, you have two choices. You can say it is coincidence. You can say that the human imagination everywhere tends toward the same themes: flood, fire, a golden age, a fall. Or you can ask a different question. What if everyone remembers the same thing because everyone survived the same event? What if the story of the flood, repeated across 5,000 years of oral tradition in cultures from Mesopotamia to the Mississippi Delta, is not a metaphor? What if it is a document? The truth may be something we are only beginning to approach. Not because the evidence is hidden, but because the evidence is enormous. Not because it stretches from the chemistry of ice cores drilled in Greenland to the orientation of stone circles in Turkey, to the grammatical structure of cuneiform texts that nobody fully understood for thousands of years. The truth may be that 12,800 years ago, something ended. Not just a warm period, not just a species, a way of being in the world, a level of accumulated knowledge, a relationship between humanity and the sky that we have been trying to reconstruct ever since, in mathematics and mythology and stone. And the truth may be that the younger Dryas, the great cold that descended so suddenly and lasted so long, was not a purely natural phenomenon in the way we usually mean that phrase. Natural forces, yes. Ice and ocean and perhaps fire from the sky, yes. But happening to a world that was not empty, not primitive, not simply waiting for civilization to begin. A world that already had something and lost it. Where are you listening from tonight? If you feel like sharing, let me know in the comments. It is always something to think about. Somewhere on this planet, someone else is lying in the dark, listening to the same words, looking up at the same sky, wondering about the same questions. Somewhere in a city, somewhere in a village, somewhere near a river that flows through a landscape carved by glacial meltwater 12,000 years ago. All of us in the long afterglow of an event we have almost entirely forgotten. Almost. The Sumerian king list is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of archaeology. Inscribed on clay tablets and stone prisms, it names the kings who ruled Sumer in sequence, along with the length of their reigns. For the kings after the flood, the reigns are human scale. Decades, generations, the kind of time we recognize. For the kings before the flood, the numbers are incomprehensible. Reigns of 28,000 years, 36,000 years. Kings who ruled for periods longer than the entirety of recorded human history. Scholars universally interpret these numbers as mythological exaggeration. Divine kings meant to seem godlike and eternal. numbers chosen for their symbolic significance. But what if the numbers mean something different? What if they are not measuring years at all? In ancient Mesopotamia, a numerical system based on 60 was used for certain calculations. The Sumerians and later the Babylonians divided the sky into 360 degrees, the hour into 60 minutes, the minute into 60 seconds. These are not arbitrary numbers. They are based on astronomical observation, on the movement of celestial bodies across a sky watched with extraordinary care for thousands of years. Some researchers have proposed that the impossibly long reigns in the king list are not measured in solar years, but in something else entirely. In cycles, in astronomical periods, in units of time that made sense to a civilization that understood the sky in ways we are only beginning to recover. Others have proposed that the kings before the flood were not human at all, that they were the Anunnaki, and that the king list is doing something that no other text in history attempts. It is recording the transition from a time when the sky beings governed directly to a time when humanity governed itself. The flood, in this reading, is not just a catastrophe. It is a boundary. Before the flood, the gods. After the flood, the kings. Before the flood, knowledge preserved in temples and stone and sky-aligned monuments. After the flood, that knowledge slowly reconstructed from fragments, from memory, from the desperate attempt to not lose everything again. Let your body feel heavy now. Let the thoughts that have been moving through your mind slow down, the way water slows when the current relaxes and the river widens. Think of the Euphrates, the great river of ancient Mesopotamia, flowing down from the mountains of what is now Turkey, through the long flat valley, through the birthplace of writing and astronomy and organized civilization as we understand it, out into the Persian Gulf. Along its banks, the first cities rose. Eridu, thought to be the oldest, Ur, whose ruins still stand in the Iraqi desert, Uruk, the city that gave its name to an entire period in the human history, Nippur, the sacred city, home of the temple of Enlil. The Sumerians believed that before cities, before humans, the Anunnaki had built their own settlements in this valley. The texts name them. Eridu was the seat of Enki, the wise one, lord of the abyss, keeper of knowledge. Nippur was Enlil's city, where the decisions of heaven were announced to the earth. These settlements were not temples to absent gods. They were described as actual places of residence, administrative centers, laboratories in a sense where the me, the divine laws and technologies, were studied, developed, and eventually distributed to humanity. There is a Sumerian text called the Eridu Genesis, soon one of the oldest flood stories in the world, predating the Mesopotamian flood account incorporated into the Epic of Gilgamesh. In it, the gods create humanity. Humanity grows and spreads. The gods, for reasons the text does not fully explain, decide to send a flood. One god, sympathetic to humanity, warns a single righteous man. The flood comes. The man survives. Civilization continues. The same story. Always the same shape. Deep beneath the Persian Gulf, oceanographers have found something unexpected. Evidence of a shallow freshwater lake that existed in what is now the Gulf during the last ice age, when sea levels were much lower. Rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates and others now submerged, flowed into this basin. The region would have been, by the standards of the late ice age, extraordinarily fertile. Well watered, warm, by its sheltered. Some researchers have proposed that this submerged landscape may have been inhabited before the end of the last ice age, before the seas rose and covered it. Thousands of years of settlement, of accumulated knowledge, of cultural development, all now underwater. When the ice melted and sea levels rose, the inhabitants would have been forced northward into the river valleys that became Mesopotamia, carrying their stories, their memories, their understanding of the sky, carrying the me. This is the thesis of researcher Jeffrey Rose, among others, who has noted that the Ubaid culture, the precursor to Sumerian civilization, appears in the archaeological record of southern Mesopotamia with a sudden sophistication that is difficult to explain by local cultural evolution alone, as if people arrived already knowing things, as if they had come from somewhere that is no longer there, as if the knowledge survived even when the homeland did not. This is the pattern that repeats when you look at the deep history of human civilization. Not gradual development, not a slow climb from cave to city, something more interrupted, more dramatic, a process that moves in pulses, in collapses and recoveries, in catastrophes that destroy almost everything, and survivals that carry forward the essential seeds. The Younger Dryas is perhaps the largest such pulse in human memory. 1,200 years of cold, megafauna extinctions across multiple continents, the collapse of early settled cultures in the Levant, the disruption of rainfall patterns across Asia, the reorganization of human populations around the world, and then, suddenly, the end. Around 11,600 years ago, the ice cores show the same kind of abrupt shift in the opposite direction. Temperatures jumped sharply, perhaps 10 degrees in a matter of years. The glaciers resumed their retreat. The forests began their northward march. The seas rose. The rivers found new courses. And humanity, which had spent 1,200 years adapting, surviving, compressing everything it knew into smaller and smaller spaces, both geographical and cultural, suddenly had room to expand again. In the Levant, the Natufians and their descendants began cultivating wheat and barley in earnest. The transition from gathering to farming was not, it seems, a triumphant invention. It was a response to necessity, a way of managing the scarce and unreliable wild resources of the Younger Dryas cold. When the cold ended, the habit remained, and the surplus it generated changed everything. In Turkey, Göbekli Tepe was being completed, or modified, or used in ways we do not fully understand. And in the river valleys to the south, someone was beginning to build the cities that would eventually be called Sumer. The word Sumer itself may have roots far older than the civilization we have attached it to. The Sumerians called their land Kiangir, the land of the civilized lords. They did not call themselves Sumerians. That name comes from the Akkadian language spoken by later peoples who absorbed Sumerian culture while adopting many of its texts, stories, and practices. The Sumerian language itself is an isolate. It has no known relatives. It does not belong to any other language family. It appeared in the river valleys of what is now Iraq as if from nowhere, fully formed, complex, grammatically sophisticated, and highly capable of expressing abstract concepts. This is unusual in the history of languages. Languages normally evolve gradually from earlier forms. They have family trees. They have cousins. Sumerian has none. Linguists have speculated for over a century about where it came from. No convincing answer has emerged. What we know is this. The people who wrote it, the people who pressed their reed styluses into wet clay tablets in the cities of Eridu and Uruk and Nippur, believed they had inherited their civilization rather than invented it. They believed the knowledge came from before them, from the time before the flood, from the Anunnaki. And they preserved that belief with extraordinary care. They copied their ancient texts onto fresh tablets as the old ones crumbled. They established schools specifically to train scribes in the art of preserving the written record. They treated certain texts as sacred precisely because of their age, because they were closer to the source. The source. Let the word source sit with you for a moment in the quiet of wherever you are. Think of a river. Stand at the mouth of the Euphrates, where it empties into the sea. The water that passes you has already come 3,000 kilometers, through marshes and cities and farmland, through desert and mountain and ancient floodplain. You could follow it all the way back past the marshes of southern Iraq, where the ancient cities once stood, back through the flat valley, the breadbasket of the ancient world, back into the mountains of Turkey, where the headwaters begin their journey downward. And somewhere in those mountains, on a limestone ridge overlooking a valley where wild grain once grew in abundance, you would come to a hill, a potbelly hill. And beneath the surface of that hill, beneath centuries of deliberately deposited fill, you would find the oldest monumental structures ever discovered by modern archaeology. Standing stones, carved with animals and symbols, oriented to the stars. The vulture stone at Göbekli Tepe has drawn particular attention from researchers interested in the astronomical dimensions of the site. It depicts what appears to be a headless human figure, a large bird, a ball or sphere, and several animals arranged in a specific pattern. Some researchers, using computer simulations of ancient star positions, have proposed that this scene encodes a specific astronomical event, the collision of a comet with the Earth. Specifically, a comet collision dated to approximately 12,900 years ago, specifically at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. This interpretation, published by researchers including Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsakritsis, suggests that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were recording an event that had happened within their cultural memory, perhaps within living memory, or the memory of their parents and grandparents. They were recording the fire from the sky. They were building a monument to survive it. They were encoding in stone, in the one material that would outlast everything else, the knowledge that the sky had once fallen, and that it might fall again. A civilization this deliberate does not build monuments to forgotten myths. A civilization this careful, this precise in its astronomical alignments, this systematic in its encoding of information in durable material, is not simply expressing religious sentiment. It is doing something that we would recognize if we saw it done today. It is archiving. The concept of the long count, the idea of tracking vast expanses of time through astronomical cycles, appears in ancient cultures with surprising frequency. The Mayans developed one of the most sophisticated calendar systems in human history, tracking cycles within cycles, the Venus cycle, the Mars cycle, the precession of the equinoxes, a wobble in the Earth's axis that takes approximately 25,000 years to complete one full circuit. The Sumerians, and later the Babylonians, tracked the same precession. They called the current age, the current position of the equinoctial sunrise against the background of constellations, the great year. The ancient Egyptians aligned their most important monuments to astronomical events with a precision that modern engineers find difficult to explain, using only the tools supposedly available to Bronze Age builders. The builders of Stonehenge in England, also beginning construction at approximately the same time as the later phases of Göbekli Tepe, oriented their monument with extraordinary precision toward the solstices. These are not coincidences of similar human intuition. These are related phenomena, evidence of a widespread ancient practice of encoding astronomical knowledge in architecture, spanning cultures and continents and thousands of years. What are they all pointing toward? Some researchers have proposed that they are all pointing toward the same event, the same moment in the precession of the equinoxes, the same position of the sky as it was when the Younger Dryas began, as if someone wanted to make absolutely certain that the memory of that moment did not disappear, as if the memory of that moment was the most important thing to preserve. There is a concept in information theory called redundancy. When you want to make sure a message is not lost, you repeat it. You encode it in multiple formats. You store it in multiple locations. You make sure that even if most of the copies are destroyed, at least one will survive. The ancient builders of stone monuments were, in a sense, practicing redundancy. The storytellers who preserved the flood myths in oral tradition across 5,000 years were practicing redundancy. The Sumerian scribes who copied the ancient texts onto fresh tablets again and again, generation after generation, were practicing redundancy. They were all protecting the same core information. And that information, stripped of its mythological encoding, stripped of the cultural language of gods and kings and divine decrees, contains a simple and urgent message. This has happened before. It can happen again. When it comes, You must survive it. And when you survive it, you must remember. Tonight, lying wherever you are in the dark, with the quiet settling around you, I want you to feel something that perhaps you have not felt before. A connection. Not just to your own history, to your family or your country or even your species. A connection to something older. To the people who stood on open ground 12,000 years ago and watched the sky turn orange. To the person who pressed the first marks into clay and called them writing. Not because writing had been invented, but because something needed to be remembered. To the builders who lifted 20-ton stones into circles and aligned them with stars and then, deliberately, buried them under the earth to wait. To wait for us. They did not know us. They could not have imagined us, the world we live in, the devices in our pockets, the satellites above our heads, the laboratories where we drill into ancient ice to read the diary of a planet. But they built for us anyway. They built for whoever came after, or for whoever would be standing on the other side of whatever catastrophe came next, looking for clues about what had been lost and what might be recovered. We are those people. We are the inheritors of everything that survived. And what did survive? Not the cities, not the specific technologies, not the names of the individuals who lived and thought and built. What survived was the pattern, the shape of the knowledge, the astronomical precision, the mathematical relationships, the stories that pointed back toward a source even when the source itself was buried under ice or water or thousands of years of silence. What survived was the memory. Let me ask you something, and you can let the answer drift through your mind as you settle toward sleep. If you knew that in your lifetime, or perhaps in your children's lifetime, or perhaps 10 generations from now, a catastrophe was coming, not certain, but possible, the kind of catastrophe that had happened before, that the sky and the ice remembered even if the people had forgotten. What would you encode in stone? What would you build to survive? What message would you leave for whoever came after, for the people who would dig through the ruins of your civilization and try to understand what had been lost? What is the most important thing you know? What is the thing that must not be forgotten? This is the question that ancient builders were answering in their way, in their time, and looking at what they built, looking at the precision of Göbekli Tepe and the alignments of Stonehenge and the astronomical ceilings of Egyptian temples and the mathematical proportions of the pyramids. Well, it seems the answer they gave was not a name, not a king, not a story of conquest. It was a map of the sky, a clock counting forward from a catastrophe, a warning written in the only language that does not change across thousands of years, the language of angles and mathematics and the movement of light through stone at specific moments on specific days. The Anunnaki, whatever they were, whatever grain of historical reality lies beneath the mythology, are associated in the ancient texts with one thing above all others: knowledge. Enki, whose name means Lord of the Earth or Lord of the sacred water beneath the earth, is consistently described as the keeper of wisdom, the one who possesses the me, the civilizational technologies. He is the one who, in multiple texts, acts to preserve humanity when other members of the divine council decide to destroy it. There is something worth pausing on there. Not the supernatural framework, not the divine council itself, but the underlying structure of the story. A group of powerful beings, a disagreement about humanity's fate, one faction arguing for survival, another for destruction. And the outcome of that argument in every version of the story is that humanity survives, but barely. With help. With something given or preserved or transmitted at the last moment. What if the something was the knowledge encoded in monuments and texts and oral traditions that we are still decoding today? What if the Anunnaki, stripped of their mythological framing, were simply the people who understood, perhaps from direct experience, that the sky could fall and the world could freeze, and that civilization, once lost, takes thousands of years to rebuild. What if they were, in the only sense that matters, the archivists? The truth may be that we will never fully answer these questions. The ice cores give us data, but data without memory. The stone monuments give us precision, but precision without explanation. The ancient texts give us stories, but stories already translated twice before they reached us. First, from whatever proto-language they began in, then into Sumerian, then into the Akkadian of the Babylonians, then into the Greek and Hebrew and Arabic of later commentators, then into English or whatever language you are hearing them in tonight. Each translation loses something. Each generation of recopying introduces small errors. Each mythological layer added by a new culture changes the proportions of what was already there. And yet something persists. The flood persists. The sky beings persist. The knowledge preserved for after the catastrophe persists. The message persists. This has happened before. Here is what we knew. We are leaving it for you. Please remember it. In the long quiet after the younger Dryas, in the warmer, calmer world that followed, human civilization did not simply continue where it had left off. It rebuilt from fragments, from the compressed memories of 1,200 years of survival, from the knowledge preserved in stone and story. It rebuilt differently. The agriculture that emerged in the Fertile Crescent after the younger Dryas was not a rediscovery. It was a continuation, sometimes in new forms. Are you of practices that had begun before the cold and that had been maintained, with difficulty, through it? The wild grasses that the Natufians had been cultivating before the younger Dryas froze them back to nomadic existence were taken up again when the cold lifted, this time with a new urgency, a new intentionality born of 1,200 years of hunger. The astronomical knowledge encoded in Göbekli Tepe was not lost when the site was buried. It survived in the alignment principles used by every subsequent culture that built monuments to the sky, in the geometric relationships that appear in pyramid designs, in the calendrical systems that regulated every ancient civilization's agriculture and religion, in the story of the sky that the Sumerians believed had been given to them by the Anunnaki. And the stories persisted. The flood myths, the tales of a golden age before the waters, the memory of beings who came from the sky and brought knowledge, and then, at some catastrophic moment, departed or died or transformed into something that could only be spoken of in the language of gods. Somewhere tonight, beneath the surface of the Gulf of Mexico, under dozens of meters of water and sediment, there may be the ruins of a settlement that existed before the end of the last ice age. Researchers have found submerged stone formations off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Cambay, dated to earlier than any officially recognized civilization. Underwater structures have been reported off the coast of Japan, off Cuba, in the Mediterranean. Most have conventional explanations: geology, natural formations, erosion, misidentification. Some do not. The search continues. As sonar mapping of the ocean floor becomes more detailed, as underwater archaeology becomes more technically capable, the possibility of finding evidence of pre-flood habitation on the continental shelves becomes more real. The continental shelves, after all, were dry land during the last ice age. They were where people lived. They were where cities, if any cities existed, would have been built. The ocean rose and covered them. They wait. What we know for certain, stepping back from all speculation, returning to the bedrock of the evidence, is this. 12,800 years ago, something happened that changed the world. The ice cores record it. The sediment layers record it. The pollen records record it. The extinction records record it. The black mat, with its exotic chemistry, records it. The abrupt end of the Clovis culture records it. The traumatic transformation of every human culture we can trace from that period records it. Something happened. and the world that existed before, that something was already, in some ways, more than we usually credit. It was a world of sophisticated hunter-gatherers who understood astronomy, a world of nascent settlements that were experimenting with architecture and agriculture, a world building towards something. That something was interrupted, and 1,200 years later, when the interruption ended, the world rebuilt towards something again. With the benefit of the memories, the stories, the stone archives, the sky maps that the survivors had preserved. And what they rebuilt, in 5,000 years, was everything you see around you. The cities, the agriculture, the writing, the science, the satellites, the ability to drill into the ice and read the diary of a planet. We are the inheritors of those who survived. We are the readers of those stone archives. We are, in a way that is not metaphorical, the continuation of a project that began before the cold. A project that asks, again and again, what is worth preserving? What is the most important thing we know? What message do we leave for whoever comes after? Let the night settle now. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breath become slow and regular, like the ocean current that still moves beneath the Atlantic, carrying heat from the tropics northward, keeping the world in the balance it has held for the past 10,000 years. The balance is delicate. The ice cores tell us that. The younger Dryas tells us that. The history of this planet, like written in every layer of sediment and every bubble of ancient air, tells us that the stability we have known is not the default state of the Earth. It is a gift, an interval, a pause in a story that is much longer and much stranger than we usually imagine. But tonight, the pause holds. The air is still. The stars are where they should be. The ocean current flows. The wheat grows. The cities stand. And somewhere underground, in layers of compressed ice or ancient sediment, the record persists. The memory of a world that froze, and a world that survived the freeze, and a world rebuilt from the fragments of everything that came before. Let me ask you one more thing before sleep takes you. If the ancient builders of Göbekli Tepe could see us now, the inheritors of everything they preserved, what do you think they would feel? Not surprise, perhaps. They built for whoever came after, and we came after. We are exactly who they built for. Maybe relief. Maybe something quieter than relief. The satisfaction of a message received, of a bottle thrown into the ocean of time and washed ashore at last on a beach the sender never saw. Here is what we knew. We are leaving it for you. We are reading it. We are listening. The younger Dryas ended 11,600 years ago, as suddenly as it began. The ice cores record the transition in a handful of annual layers. 1 year, the cold. The next year, warmth. The glaciers retreated for the last time. The forests began their final northward march. The seas rose to approximately their present levels. The world settled into the climate we have known ever since. And humanity, which had survived 1,200 years of cold and loss and compression and desperate preservation, walked out into the warmth again. They carried everything they had managed to hold on to. They began to build. Tonight, 10,000 years later, you are lying in a structure built from materials quarried and shaped and assembled by generations of human beings descended from those survivors. The technology around you traces its lineage through 1,000 incremental steps back to the first deliberate shaping of stone and the first deliberate marking of clay. The stories you grew up with, the myths and religions and philosophical traditions of your culture, carry within them, however transformed, however many times reinterpreted, the residue of the oldest human memories. The flood, the sky beings, the golden age that was lost, the knowledge preserved and passed down. You are, in a sense that is both scientific and deeply personal, the continuation of a very long story. A story that began when the sky was full of fire. A story that continued through the cold. A story that was rebuilt from fragments by hands that understood both the fragility and the resilience of what they were trying to preserve. The ice is still there. High in Greenland, the layers that recorded the younger Dryas are still compressed in the cores extracted by drilling teams over the past 50 years. The chemistry is still readable. The boundary layers are still sharp and clear. The stone is still there. On a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, the most ancient monumental structures ever found by modern archaeology still stand, partially excavated, partially underground, still holding their encoded information, still oriented to a sky that has shifted slightly over 12,000 years, but that still turns the same ancient wheel. The stories are still there. On clay tablets in museums from Baghdad to Berlin to Philadelphia, the oldest written words in human history still record what the ancient Sumerians believed about how civilization began. The flood, the Anunnaki, the me, the knowledge given and preserved and passed down. And you are still here, in the dark, listening. Part of an unbroken chain of listeners all the way back to the firelight. Where are you listening from tonight? Somewhere on this strange small planet, spinning in the dark, carrying its archive of ice and stone and story, around a star that does not know we are here. Somewhere the air is cool, and the night is quiet, and the questions the ancient builders were asking are still the same questions we are asking. Who built what we found? What did they know that we have lost? What are we preserving for whoever comes after us? The younger Dryas does not have clean answers. The Anunnaki do not have definitive identifications. Göbekli Tepe does not have a full translation. The black mat does not have a single agreed-upon cause. The mystery is intact, and the mystery is, in its own way, a gift. It means the story is not finished. It means the ice is still being read, the stones are still being excavated, the tablets are still being translated. It means that the archive left by those ancient, careful, sky-watching builders is still yielding its secrets. Slowly, layer by layer, year by year, like the ice. Let the story rest now. Let the mammoths graze in the grasslands of your dreams. Let the stars of 12,000 years ago wheel slowly overhead in a sky without cities, without light pollution, close enough to touch. Let the stones of Göbekli Tepe stand in the silence of the limestone plateau, their carvings facing outward toward a sky that records everything, every catastrophe, every cold, every warmth, every living thing that has ever breathed beneath it. Let the rivers of ancient Mesopotamia carry their slow brown water down through the valley of the first cities, down past the ruins of Eridu, where the first temple stood, down into the gulf where the submerged land waits under the warm salt water, holding whatever remains of whatever was there before the flood. Let the Anunnaki, whatever they were, whatever fragment of reality anchors their mythology, recede into the long dark of deep time, where the questions they leave behind are more important than the answers we have not yet found. And let yourself drift towards sleep, knowing this: you are the inheritors. The cold came, and the world survived it. The knowledge was preserved, imperfectly, in stone and story and the chemical memory of ice. And here you are, still wondering, still listening, still looking up at the stars and asking the oldest question. What are we? Where did we come from? What were we before the cold? The night is quiet now. The questions can rest until morning. The stars are where they have always been, and the ice remembers everything. Sleep well.